Welcome everybody. It's great to see people joining in this again. So this week it's following on from the introductory session that we did week before last, and we're looking at the first step of the ethical AI framework for education that I introduced in that initial session. And this particular webinar is very much focusing on schools, colleges, universities, on educational institutions. There's a second one on Thursday, which is focusing on businesses, because I think we need to look slightly differently, and particularly in terms of picking the examples. So, AI readiness, what is it all about? In this webinar, I'm going to explain the basics of AI with particular reference to examples drawn from education. And what I really want to do is explain why data is so important to modern AI, because I want you to be able to start looking at your school, college, university through an AI and data lens. So this is what it's all about, trying to help people look at their institutions through this data lens and develop an AI mindset. I'm also going to say something about why having an AI mindset is important for educators. And it's the same team as we had last week behind these AI readiness webinars and the course that we'll be presenting over the next few weeks. So it's Carmel, Ali, Mutlu, myself, Anissa, and Ben, and we're really pleased to be talking you through the 7 steps to AI readiness with the framework called ethical, as a really good reminder that we must be careful to ensure that whatever we do with AI, we do it in an ethical way. So I introduced this framework in the first webinar, and today we're really focusing on that first step, which is about educating people about AI, helping them to think things through from an AI perspective, and hopefully making them feel excited and enthused about the kinds of things you can do with AI to support education. So the basics of AI. Obviously, in a short session like this, it's very hard to communicate everything that's happened in AI, but I'm going to try and convey the very basic elements of artificial intelligence. Halfway through, I'm going to stop for some questions, and then we'll do the second half of the webinar. And as ever, there's a condensed version of the slides with my audio available on our website, which lasts half an hour, as opposed to the hour that we have for the website, so that we can take questions. Okay, so we can think about technology being capable of actions and behaviors that require intelligence. As I said in the first seminar, there's so many different definitions of AI that it can be difficult to get people to agree on one. But I think for our purposes, this is a pretty good place to start. And all over the place, we see stories about how AI is being used in education and perhaps its transformational potential. But where did it all start? Well, we often associate AI with robots, although it's extremely important to remember that AI and robotics are not the same thing. Not all robots use AI, and not all AI is robots. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting to think about robots, and I looked up to see if I could find out when the first use of the word robot occurred, and I found this play by Czech writer Karel Čapek, who painted the picture of these dystopian robot characters that were bringing all sorts of ills to the world. It's hard to tell the humans from the robots in this picture. And I worry that somehow we might be moving back in the 2020s to the 1920s if we're not careful, by not realizing how very, very different human intelligence is to artificial intelligence, which is a point that I made in the introductory webinar, and it's something that will come up again and again. But where did it all start? Well, September 1956 is the point where we often think of the birth of artificial intelligence happening. And this was a time when a group of, and it was, I'm afraid, all men, a group of men, 10 men, got together at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and their remit over the 2-month summer space that they were working through, I would say it's a summer holiday, but obviously they were working, so it wasn't, but over the summer break, when they were focusing on this particular task, was to study the basis of human learning and try to see if they could find a way of describing every feature of human intelligence so precisely that a machine could be made to simulate it. And they really felt they could make significant progress in one or more areas of human intelligence over that 2-month summer period. It sounds crazy now, but at the time they really believed it. Another very important couple of people who were influential on early work in robotics and artificial intelligence, if we look at Norbert Wiener, who was very much the father of the field of cybernetics, which is the scientific study of control and communications in animals and machines. He was looking to see what you could learn from animals in order to be able to create machines that could move and that could control their movement. And then Alan Turing, the very famous mathematician, was famously known, or is famously known for a paper that he wrote about the Turing test, which is the situation in which a computer can be called intelligent because it deceives humans into believing that it's humans. And for lots of people in computer science and AI, there are still Turing test competitions where people get together and try and fool their peers into believing their program is a human or their human is a program. So it's still a field of study. And these were highly influential on what happened when it came to the early days of AI. But probably one of the most famous early AI programs is something called ELIZA. And ELIZA was operated on a machine through a text interface. You can see it here. It's a conversation. And ELIZA is playing the role of a psychotherapist. And you approach the machine, you type in your question, and ELIZA offers you an answer. And you can see in this little dialogue, the person using the machine on which ELIZA is running is saying, "I have a terrible headache." Yeah. ELIZA's response is, "Maybe you should consult a doctor of medicine. I'm a psychiatrist." "Okay, I'll do that then." ELIZA comes back with, "Can you elaborate on that?" And the person sitting at the computer says, "What are you talking about?" "No, I cannot elaborate." ELIZA comes back with, "Why do you say that?" Person using the system says, "Now you're just talking nonsense." ELIZA comes back with, "What makes you believe now I am just talking nonsense?" And you can see how quickly the system fell over there. But I'd have to say that a lot of people were taken in by ELIZA and did believe that there was a psychiatrist, operating ELIZA and giving them advice. But this kind of system operates using rule-based pattern matching. So ELIZA is basically a whole set of rules of the form, if this, then give this action or do this action. So if you look at that last piece of the dialogue where the person using the machine says, "Now you're just talking nonsense," and ELIZA comes back with, "What makes you believe now I am just talking nonsense?" That could have been sparked by a rule of the form, if you're XX then X, you're just talking nonsense, then ELIZA's response is, "What makes you believe that I am XX, i.e. in this situation, just talking nonsense?" So it seems very crude and basic, but actually this type of system became quite elaborate and was used to produce some quite useful expert systems, particularly in the area of medical diagnosis. And indeed, within education, this kind of approach using these rules was used for some of the very early artificial intelligence in education systems, like this one that's called Buggy, which was developed by John Seeley Brown and Richard Burton, to try and understand the mistakes that children make when they're learning arithmetic. So it would have rules for how you go about arithmetic, in this example addition, but it would also have rules of the bugs that people experience or action when they're trying to do addition. So it would have buggy rules and true rules. And then the idea was to try and diagnose a student as they were making the mistake through this set of rules so that you could give them appropriate advice. And some of the modern AI systems that are used in education, such as those produced by Carnegie Learning, which is a very successful company in the US, are born out of this tradition of intelligent tutoring systems, where you have a student using some kind of computer through standard kind of interface, and the system behind it basically has three main components. One that represents the system's knowledge of a particular domain, so in this example, maths. Another module that represents the way the learner is or is not successful at completing the activities that they're asked to do whilst using the computer system. And then the third one, which is a model of how teaching happens. And those three main components interact to create the kinds of interactions that students can use when faced with this kind of intelligent tutoring system. Now, as you can see, this interface is pretty horrid and very difficult to use, requires a lot of reading. And the interfaces to these systems have improved enormously. But their origination is very much in these production rule systems. But there were some really game-changing moments in the last decade, and now more recently in the last 10 years, that we really need to think about when we're trying to understand the basics of AI. One very big moment came when I was doing my PhD, and it was the moment when IBM's computer Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, the world chess grandmaster. And that was really amazing. And I can remember as a student, the excitement in the department when this happened, people believing that now we'd cracked chess. Chess is something that intelligent people play, therefore we must be getting to the roots of what intelligence is. But of course, IBM's Deep Blue was based on the same kind of rule system that grew out of that early ELIZA example. And therefore, whatever you wanted the chess playing computer to be able to do, you had to write the program to make that happen in advance. And these systems couldn't learn. Whatever you built in the first place was the knowledge that that machine had about playing chess. And then in 2016, a real game-changing moment, AlphaGo versus Lee Sedol, the time when a computer beat a human at the game of Go. And it beat a human by teaching itself how to play Go. It learned from lots and lots and lots of experiences of playing Go. But I think it's important to remember one thing about this. My understanding is that the game of Go is not just about the winning board position. It's also about the relationships that you create as you're playing the game of Go. And therefore, one might argue that AlphaGo probably didn't create many relationships whilst learning to play Go, whereas Lee Sedol probably did. And that again brings us back to this notion of the difference between human and artificial intelligence. Now, for other concepts, it's important to think about when we're thinking about the basics of AI. Two concepts that are emphasized in a very, very good basic course that's free, called Elements of AI, developed in Finland. If anybody wants to know more about AI, I recommend this course. I think it's very good. And they emphasize the importance of autonomy. We want AI systems that can perform tasks in complex environments without constantly being guided by a human. And we want them to be adaptive. We want them to have the ability to improve performance by learning from experience. Now, those early systems couldn't do these things, couldn't learn from experience. We now have the kinds of systems that use machine learning and can learn from experience. And two other important concepts are the sort of AI that we have at the moment can be called narrow AI or sometimes domain-specific AI. It's AI that can handle one particular task, playing chess, diagnosing an illness, driving a car, or maybe recognizing images. But the AI that can play chess can't diagnose an illness, and it can't drive a car. And the AI that can drive a car can't do the other things either. But a human who can diagnose an illness can probably drive a car. I guess they can recognize images, and they may well be able to play chess. So artificial general intelligence is the situation that many scientists are hoping to achieve, where they can create an AI system that, like a human, can tackle intellectual tasks of multiple different sorts. Of course, there's a big question. Is artificial general intelligence really possible? And many people believe that it is. Personally, I don't, because I think human intelligence is much, much smarter than we give it credit for. And I think that artificial and human intelligence are not the same, and that there are really important differences that we need to focus on, because we want a world where humans are complemented by AI automation, not replaced by it. And I certainly do not envisage a world where teachers are replaced by AI, that's for certain. And in the first session, I went through the different complex elements of human intelligence, many of which are not available to AI systems. So it's important for us to remember that what we're trying to achieve is a blended human artificial intelligence ecosystem, where the AI augments our human intelligence, enhances it, helps us to achieve more, but not one that replaces us. So why is data so important to modern AI? Well, I think it's important in answering this question to just take a little look back at some of those first AI system, good old-fashioned AI system methods, in order to be able to understand why data has been the game changer and why it's so important. So if we think about what we affectionately call good old-fashioned AI, yes, we use things like those rules that were started with the ELIZA system and then built into expert medical diagnosis systems and systems that went about tutoring. But we need to think, first of all, that AI of the old-fashioned sort is symbolic. It uses language in the form of production roles, for example. And one of the very important aspects of early AI was what was called search. Now, search was a method for finding a solution to a problem. And it was born out of game playing. So it was born out of studying Connect 4 or a game of chess in the IBM example. And the idea is that you try and create all the possible states that might exist in the game and then pick the best one at each move so that you have the best chance of winning. Now, we need a closed system. A game is a closed system, a fixed system where there is set rules and a set space. So you can, in theory, identify all the possible states that exist as you play the game. But if we try and take something a little bit more realistic, we could imagine a very simple classroom. And somewhat unrealistically, this class has a very fixed number of furniture, tables, chairs, a whiteboard, some books, paper, perhaps some tablet computers. But let's simplify things a bit more and say that we have 30 chairs and 6 tables, and that our classroom normally has 30 students. However, because of the COVID-19 going back to school regulations, it means that we have to separate all students by 2 meters. So we need to think about how we might do that. Well, we could do it something like this, but this way we can only seat 4 students. That doesn't sound very successful. We can't make the classroom any bigger. It's 10 meters by 8 meters. Well, this is another configuration that we might try. And in fact, there are multiple different configurations, and it doesn't take long as you're starting to look at the different configurations before you find there's an awful lot of different possibilities. And this was one of the downfalls of those early search systems, the search methodology of AI. So much of that early work, as I said, started off in game playing. And if you take a game of noughts and crosses, it's quite straightforward to create all of the possible states that can exist as the game is played. And then at each step, make a decision about which one is going to give you, as the player, the optimal route through the game. But even in games, this can become enormous and intractable. So if you take chess as an example, if you want to look ahead 2 moves and create all the possible states that could exist at a point in gameplay of chess, 2 moves will create 1,225 possible states, and 20 moves would create 2.7 quadrillion possible states. You see how impossible it becomes. And so search had to think of a way of being pruned, and many different ways of pruning these enormous spaces that the computer was having to search through were invented. And some of them were more successful than others. The idea was to try and prune the different sorts of states that you needed to look at in order to be able to make a good decision about what move to play next. But really, AI needed to move away from these very closed system domains if it was going to be useful in the real world. And those real world systems certainly initially did hark back to the ELIZA type production rules. So you can think of a situation, if Jane looks sad, then give her some praise. And there was even a proposal that perhaps thought was based on production rules like this. And as I said, some of the very successful cognitive tutors produced by Carnegie Learning were based on this production rule system. And here's an example of a maths tutor and a rule that would exist in this maths tutor for this particular problem that we're seeing on the screen at the moment. But even here, you can see how quickly the rules become quite complex. So here we've got, if there are no subgoals, and F1 is one of the given fractions, and F2 is the other given fraction, and you can see them both on the screen. And D1 is the denominator of F1, and D2 is the denominator of F2, and D1 is a multiple of D2, then set a subgoal to convert F2 to denominator D1. Set a subgoal to add F1 and the converted fraction. And so the rules can become very complex very quickly. And as I said previously, they're fixed when the program is written. But a lot of time was spent within AI doing what was called knowledge elicitation, sitting down with experts and talking them through their expertise, how they tackled problems, in order to try and create a knowledge base of rules that was representative of that expert's understanding of a particular subject. And it was successful to an extent. But of course, there were problems. It was useful to have systems like this because they were very transparent and therefore could be explained to the humans who were using them. It was relatively straightforward to identify which rules had been used to reach a particular decision. But these systems can't learn, and they're also very, very poor at dealing with uncertainty. And this is where data and machine learning comes in. Rather than working out in advance what the AI system is going to be able to do, machine learning processes data about the world and learns from that data. Now, we're not going to look at different sorts of machine learning algorithms today. We'll do a little bit of that when we get to step 5, because that's where we, in our AI readiness approach, apply different AI techniques to data. But for now, it's important to understand why data matters so much to machine learning. And that's the focus of what we're doing here. And so if we take some classic machine learning challenges, tasks, systems, here's a couple. One that's set out to recognize items in images. So we want the computer to be able to recognize an instance of an aeroplane or an instance of a ship or a deer. And the way that we create a system that can do that is by showing or letting the algorithm experience thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of instances of a picture of an aeroplane or a picture of a ship or a picture of a deer, so that it learns the pattern that that item makes in an image. And then when it's given a novel image of an aeroplane, a ship, or a deer, it can recognize the pattern in that image and say, yes, that's a plane. No, that isn't a plane. Or the second one, when we've got speech to text, we want a system that can recognize speech as it happens and translate that speech into text, perhaps. And these are classic machine learning problems. Another couple, medical diagnosis from images, being able to analyze these images and identify tumors. This is a lung cancer diagnostic system. And another very often used task for machine learning is classifying things. Again, looking for patterns and saying, okay, that pattern of a thing belongs in this category. And so we can start to ask, well, where would that be useful in education? So we can think, well, classification might be useful, for example, in classifying essays or assignments into grades. Speech recognition can be very helpful for students who find a keyboard or a mouse difficult to manipulate. And we can't start thinking about, well, what's the data that we would need in order to build machine learning systems that would complete these tasks? So in that first one, you'd need lots of examples of essays and assignments of different grades so that the algorithm could gradually see what the pattern is that distinguishes this grade from that grade. But let's think about the way that we learn from data all the time. And this is a very, very simple example. Most people know the game Guess Who, where each player has a set of cards, images of people, and you have to try and guess the identity of a mystery card being held by one of your opponents. And you ask your opponent a question. That's collecting data. And we learn from that data. And we gradually get better at playing the game because we learn how to ask the right questions as we collect that data. Well, now think about an AI system that might be using machine learning to identify a student for a tutor who's working remotely. And this tutor might be a language tutor who teaches several hundred different students over the course of a week. Well, it would be very useful for that teacher to have an AI system that would identify clearly the students as she's looking at them in the classroom. And we might think about how we could use machine learning to help build an algorithm that would learn from multiple instances of pictures of all of the children that the human tutor interacts with over the course of a week. And the system would then be able to recognize the pattern of that student when the teacher is interacting with them in their classroom. So it's certainly a tool that can be very useful in education. And of course, it has the advantage that it can learn and it can deal with uncertainty, something that old-fashioned AI couldn't do. But the problem with machine learning, or one of the problems, is that it's hard to know what's happening. You can't see when a rule's been fired. You can't easily understand why machine learning has made a decision. Maybe it's recognized an aeroplane in the other. It's hard to know where it went wrong. And it's very hard to explain any decisions that the machine learning makes to humans. So I'm going to stop for a few minutes for some questions now. I'm going to go back to Roland, who's emceeing, and ask him if there are any questions. And then we'll go on with the second half of the webinar.
Hi Rose, hello everybody. Just in the chat so far at the moment, we've got one question from Mohammed here, which is, how is reinforcement learning being used or expected to be used in the future to deliver individualized instruction?
Well, that's a very good question. And actually, reinforcement learning is something that we'll talk about a bit more at step 5. So I think I might revisit that question in step 5, because I'm worried that if I try and answer it now, I'll baffle the people who don't know what reinforcement learning is because I haven't explained it. But basically, it's an interesting question because we would be wanting to ensure that the machine learning algorithm that's responsible for individualizing some form of instruction for a learner is trained, and that training includes some element of reinforcement. But we also need to make sure that we don't build machine learning algorithms that are very set in what they recognize, and that they just end up embodying a set of biases in the same way that as humans we often embody a set of biases, particularly as we teach. Now, there may be different biases, but we need to try and make sure that whatever we do with the machine learning, we try and avoid our own biases and any other biases that might come into the system. So I think when we talk more about different sorts of machine learning, we can look at what role reinforcement learning might or might not play in that scenario. Anything else, Roland?
No, Mohammed says, thank you, Rose. So in the meantime, I think if we just go ahead, and then if anybody has any other questions.
Had some more questions, they can think them up for the end, that's right. So now I want you to think about yourself, your school, or any kind of teaching institution, and try and look at it through a data and AI lens. And I'm going to welcome my friend Karine, who was a primary school teacher for many years, and she's been an inspector and an advisor. And we're basically going to have a conversation about data and how you can see your school through a data lens. And then we're going to think about how we might use AI thinking in order to change the way that you might be thinking about your school in data terms at the moment. So welcome to Karine. Thank you very much for joining me. It's a great pleasure to have you on our webinar. So can you just say a little tiny bit about your experience of being a head teacher and the way that you personally might tackle data in your day-to-day role with your staff, as the school was when you were teaching there, which is very recently?
Yes, so I was a head for more than 20 years, and the school is saturated with data. So if I just can give you the sort of broad categories of data that a school like mine would have had. So we had the learner data. There was obviously attendance, there was special needs, free school meals, personal data, safeguarding, teacher assessment, testing, progress from the different key stages for baseline and pupil surveys. That will give you a feel of one sort of data. But then there was teacher data, moderation of work between schools and how they were doing it, observation of quality of teaching and learning, teachers' subject knowledge, which we did in various ways because we had systems that could see the teachers and they could evaluate themselves teaching. We had book moderation, performance reviews, all gave us sets of data for the teachers. And then there was the external data that came to us by the LEA, Ofsted advisors, experts we brought in, and parent surveys. Now, this data was all used for different things, but essentially we had an iterative cycle where once every term we would get together. So if we were looking at the gaps in perhaps children's learning or where we were doing better or worse at school, we would hold pupil progress meetings. And during those pupil progress meetings, we would be looking at a number of those elements of data. First of all, starting with the baseline of where they'd got with formative and summative assessment, perhaps through our pupil conferencing, how the children felt. And then we might be looking at the quality of teaching and learning through the books, the observation, to try and pull together all of those strands to try and answer some of the key questions that data threw up for us.
And that sounds like quite a challenging task, because you've got data about teachers, data about learners, data from outside, data from inside, quite a lot of subjective data, some more objective data.
It's a huge task because in terms of quality control of, if you just think about teachers, teacher assessment and teachers in the infancy of their craft or even more experience, it might be that when people are recording their teacher assessments, for example, the accuracy isn't there. Also, how do you bring on board all that other data to know how it's affecting learning? And the reality is, with being very time poor in all schools, and I've worked in across key stages, every education establishment is short of time. So you're asking people to do this, and they're spending hours and hours on sheets. So the margin for error is huge all the way through. Yeah. Just record, and then interpreting that data, and also they're asking the right questions to find out if we're pinpointing the right things to be able to close the gap within our school is a massive thing that we have to do, and something that actually we need a lot of training in schools, because we're novices compared to scientists and people who are really analysing data and cleaning data. So there's lots for us to learn and do, and lots of margin for error is huge.
That's really interesting. And can you think about a particular problem that you might have been looking to focus on when you perhaps did this analysis on a termly basis that we could kind of talk through?
Yeah, well, one that came up quite often, and we every year, when we just thought we got it right, back we went again a year later, would be the gender gap between boys and girls in maths. So we would be trying to pinpoint what it was we were doing in maths that was continuing with that gap. So even though we managed to sometimes close it, we never closed it completely, and we spent a huge amount of time analysing that and the data that we had that might support that.
So that's interesting. So I'm guessing that it could have been a case of you know, maybe the way that the class was organized into sets or not into sets might have had an impact on that gap, or it could have been to do with quality of teaching, or it could have been to do with individual differences between the children, apart from their gender, obviously. What kind of data were you able to collect to look at that problem, and did you feel that it was rich enough?
Okay, so we tried to look at a number of things. We first of all, we looked at the teachers' confidence levels at teaching maths and their subject expertise. We tried to find out as well about the children's readiness to learn and their mindsets, but that was done through questionnaires. We were speaking to the children and through questionnaires that we gave them each term. We also tried with the parents to see what support they were getting at home, and that was an interesting one because it's quite often that parents will say, I'm not good at maths, therefore, you know, I don't expect my child to be good at maths. It was quite an interesting perception. But we also tried to look at the teacher assessment with the summative assessment and the pupil conferencing, and sometimes they didn't match. So we had a lot of data as well as children's readiness to learn, because they might have had special needs or they might have had vulnerabilities that we need to consider before they even start a lesson. So we try to pull that together with teachers' confidence levels at teaching maths. The reality is, despite us having all that data, we still weren't successful. Doesn't matter which way I like to string it to you, we might close the gap, messages here or there. But, you know, and we went to look at other schools as well to see if they had other ideas, and we brought experts in to come and have a look at us. But we weren't, whatever we were doing with the data, we weren't asking quite the right question, because we were putting the data together or trying to, and it was taking hours. And we were trying to marry up what the data was showing with what we were seeing and then making improvements. So I remember one year we thought setting is not working for this cohort of children. Why are we doing it? They need something totally different. We looked at even down to manipulatives. Was manipulatives helping girls to learn? You know, girls seem to prefer it compared to boys when they were learning to construct maths, but then they never seem to want to let go of it. So we had all these bits, but it was like we had the bits of the jigsaw, but we hadn't got them together in any coherent way that was having an impact. And we were spending hours on it. And that was just one little issue that was thrown up from the basic data, from the formative and summative data.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? You know, as humans, it's very hard for us to deal with that, all of those different sorts of data. And as the data increases in size, and you know, you might want to compare 1 year with the year before and the year before, and really try and pinpoint exactly what that gap is. And you also said something really interesting there about contextual data. You know, what is the home context? What is the, you know, what's the kind of conversation that a parent might be having if they themselves are not confident with maths, and how does that impact on the child? And again, I'm really struck as we're talking about the subjective nature of a lot of that data. It's something that we have to deal with all the time, and there's not necessarily something wrong with subjective data. It's a useful data source, but I'm wondering if it's worth thinking about whether there are some more objective data sources that might be useful in a situation like this, thinking that we do now have some sort of AI techniques that we could use to do some of the analysis that is very difficult for humans to do. What about the teacher training and sort of leadership, quality of leadership? Does that impact, do you think, on this kind of a problem?
At all levels. So we try a number of things. The issue for us is you might have a very good maths director in your school, or coordinator, whatever you like to call them, in your school, but actually when they're planning maths, they might be planning in teams. In our school, we planned in teams, so they were released on a certain day to work in teams. But if the people working together, and we were a junior school, a fairly large junior school, if within that group there wasn't a leader of maths, even though you might make triads or however the school's organised it, but that really had mastery of the subject, then actually that leadership sometimes was not, you know, didn't help the situation at all. The other thing is within schools that concerned us hugely was the amount of teacher talk compared to student talk. And that was another thing. And we even tried to look at the, and we had various technologies that could do this. We even tried to look at the hidden curriculum, you know, how, if teachers are underconfident and the students are underconfident, what are the body language, what's the tone, what's all those things that children pick up. So you've got this whole set of data, but what happens in schools is you end up with, if I'm really hard-nosed about it, an iterative set of activities where you have pupil conferencing and teachers spend huge amounts of hours collecting and recording and then writing a report that goes into a final report that goes into the head teacher and then into the local authority or whoever's inspecting you. But actually, have we asked the right question and have we understood what's before us? And have we spent enough time on it? Because what happens is you get the next year and then you're on to something, you're looking at a different issue. So teacher training is huge.
That's a couple of things you said there I think are really interesting. Yeah, that sounds really important. And what you've just said makes me think about a way in which we could look at how AI could help in a situation like this, because from what I understand, you've said you do a lot of recording, presumably using something like the IRIS system that I know exists in many schools. And so you would have access to video and audio of children and teachers during maths lessons.
Yeah, we use that quite a lot. We use that very much so for, and lots of schools have it and don't use it, which is such a shame, because one of the important things is to catch teachers doing things right, not always to catch them, you know, we've got an education system premised on catching people doing things wrong, not necessarily things right. So by teachers videoing themselves, I videoed myself. It's really interesting if you plan a lesson and then teach it in pairs or threes or fours and try to help each other out, because there are things that you do you don't even realise that you're doing.
Yes, and that's really interesting. And of course, analysing that video can take a huge amount of time. I remember many years ago, I had a PhD student who was doing some research using what was then a novel device, which was a camera that the teacher wore around their neck, and there was a time delay, say every 1 second or every 2 seconds, it was take a picture of the class. And I remember how long it took, even with that, which was, you could speed up. So it was like a slightly faster moving video, but it would take ages to look through it and then to talk through it with the teacher. And this is somewhere where AI can be really helpful, because that kind of analysis of video and audio is relatively straightforward. And for example, thinking about what you've just said would be really not at all difficult to analyze the recordings to see the difference between the amount of teacher talk and the amount of student talk, because you were saying that sometimes teachers talk too much and we need to let students talk more as well. But I also remember what you were saying about it's really important to find the positive, and I couldn't agree more. So I think it's also interesting to think how we could use voice analysis to understand more about confidence, both in teachers and in learners. And that would be something that you could completely sort of delegate to the AI to do that analysis and to come up with some predictions, or to identify and give back to you information about teacher and student talk and the percentages and ratios between them, and also looking at the audio data. And incidentally, what we found in AI is that if you look at a combination of voice data and facial expression data, you get much more accurate interpretations of confidence, for example, than you do just looking at the facial data. Now, obviously, there are a lot of ethical issues here, and they would need to be overcome. But if this information is being recorded anyway, it seems to me as if that's a source that the AI could deal with and give you some really useful information. And the AI could also help to bring together some of those other data sources that you've mentioned, so that you could get, looking at attendance data, looking at maybe what the scores are on which you're basing the belief that there is a gap between girls and boys, because it may be that actually those scores are not the best representation of how much those boys and girls do understand about maths. So I think it's a really nice example of a way in which identifying that problem, that big gap in maths that we believe is there between boys and girls, thinking about the data that's available to you, and then thinking about how we can use AI to analyze some of that data in a way that you haven't been able to previously, that would give you more information to help you understand more about what is going on, and how we could also use AI to analyze some of the data that you have already been trying to analyze. And it's really about bringing the different data sources together, because there will be an optimal subset of those different data sources that will be the most effective at helping us to understand more what's going on there. Now, as we progress through the different steps in the framework, we might come back to this problem and see if we can identify how we would use the AI, what data we would use as we go through these different steps. But just for today, I wanted to make the point, thank you, Karine, that—
Can I just say, Rose, that
yes, of course,
if AI is able to do this for us, or for all of us, it would free teachers to do what they came into the profession to do, to actually
absolutely
focus on the quality of teaching and learning, the relationships with the students, and to develop their own professional capital. Because if there was an analysis done on how much time teachers are actually collecting data when they're novice at some of the data that we're collecting, I'm talking about teachers, head teachers, myself included in that, it is disproportionate to what we should be doing in our job, and yet we could utilize that data in a fantastic way and it would release us.
And that's exactly how it should be done. We should be using our AI to help enhance our human experience, our human professional experience, and the ability of teachers to spend the time doing what it is they really want to be doing with students. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you, Karine. That was really helpful. And so that example was about showing you how we can look at particular problems in a school through the data that school has. And that was just one little example. But it's interesting to think, as we look at a school, a college, a university, there's an enormous amount of data that can be collected about the buildings, about the people, about individual learners and the subjects they do or don't do well at, their emotions towards these subjects, and indeed their preferences. What do they enjoy? There's so much data that can be available from any institution. And then there's data that we haven't thought about collecting that could really help us to understand the particular problems that institution is facing. And that's what this AI readiness is really all about. Now, before I go into the final section, I'm going to stop again because you might have some questions for Karine or myself. So I'm going to go back to Roland and see whether there are any questions that you would like answered at this particular moment in time. Roland, back to you.
Hi, Rose. So just the one off the back of some of the things that Karine was talking about. So Fancy has asked, based on Karine's experience of taking all this data from school, and as she said, with a caveat that some of it comes across with a lot of errors, he wanted to know which non-behavioural data across students, teachers, or schools is important to feed a machine to improve learning outcomes.
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to come back to Karine and ask her to think about what non-behavioural data she would find useful. From a point of view of feeding machine learning, I mean, non-behavioural data, when you're coming to look at learning outcomes, is tricky because, of course, learning is a behaviour and you're trying to influence that behaviour. But certainly there would be data about the particular school, the school's location, the nature of the way that school was organised, the curriculum, the structure of classes, the sets. We spoke about setting and whether setting works. So there are factors like that that are non-behavioural that can be very useful when you're thinking about learning. Karine, do you have any other thoughts about non-behavioural data that you would say?
I think one of the things is the class arrangement with the number of pupils, because I think that's really, really important to have a look at. Some schools have, in my own school, we had 35 children. Now, whether you like it or not, they're boxes that some of the classrooms are in, and children don't all learn by putting in a box, sitting on a table. So the arrangement and talking about collaboration and things like that is really important. So the actual arrangement and the, if you like, the context of how your school is built has an impact on learning.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting. It's often what we forget is that really important factor of how that context is organized. Absolutely brilliant. Thanks,
And
Kerry.
going
I
around
hope that helped
classrooms,
to
sorry,
answer the question.
one of the things we
Go on,
would
no, go on,
do
Kerry.
is actually go around classrooms to look at the arrangements for
Yeah.
children with understanding their backgrounds, or trying to get a really good understanding of their backgrounds about how the teachers had arranged things to suit the needs of those pupils. And it's often something that isn't thought of, it isn't trained for. So if you go into lots of schools now, I mean, you'll see it now because of COVID, the tables are separated, but actually you wouldn't see very much difference sometimes in the arrangements, because the classroom is small and it has an effect on learning. So those sorts of things, and allowing children not necessarily to be sitting while they're learning, those sorts of things have a massive effect.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. Right, on to the last section, and then there'll be a final opportunity for any questions. So why an AI mindset is important for educators? Well, I think there's no question in my mind other than that AI is going to have an enormous impact on education, and possibly an even greater impact because of the amount of technology that's been used during lockdown and the way in which we might enhance the use of that technology using AI. So we can think of impact and the need for us to think about AI and develop that AI mindset in three categories. We can think about the way we can use AI to tackle some of the big educational challenges, the kinds of individualized tutoring systems that might be useful in a school, the voice-activated interfaces that can be useful. We can think about educating people about AI so that they can use it safely and effectively. And we also need to think about the way that the education system needs to change so that we can focus more on the elements of human intelligence that are different to AI and better prepare people for an AI augmented world. And these three different categories are certainly not mutually exclusive. You know, work we do towards one is likely to help one of the others or both of the others. And so it is a cycle, and we need to build that cycle. Now, one of the things that we do using the Educate Golden Triangle methodology, and that I think can be hugely helpful, and why I'm so keen for educators to develop an AI mindset and to become AI ready, is that I think we do need to bring together the people who are developing our AI edtech systems with the people who are using them, teachers, learners, parents, depends what the system is designed to support. And indeed, researchers like the team here who can build the bridges between the communities and really start to build co-design partnerships across these different stakeholders so that we can start to build the cycle, the virtuous cycle of the different sorts of things that we need to do in education with respect to AI. And the reason the triangle is called the Golden Triangle is because the gold is the data and the evidence that can help us understand whether any piece of technology is or is not being effective. But it's also the heart of what AI is about, this data. And so I think if we can get our developers, who probably don't understand very much about teaching and learning, working with our educators who probably don't understand very much about AI, why would they? Through working with people such as researchers in our Educate team to help build those communities of cross-stakeholder co-design partnerships. And we end up with a situation where our educators who've developed an interest and an AI readiness can really start to understand more and more by working with AI developers. And AI developers can start to understand a great deal more about teaching and learning. And we should end up with better AI technologies in the classroom, but also an educator population that understands a great deal more about AI, and AI developers who understand a great deal more about teaching and learning. And that's something where teams such as ours have a really important role to play in helping to bring these communities together. Because whenever you bring communities together from different disciplines, from different backgrounds, you need somebody to help you get the communication right, because different types of people from different backgrounds can use the same word to mean totally different things, can use different language to mean the same thing, and there are lots of different pitfalls. So we need to bring the three communities together, and that way we should end up with much, much better AI in education and a much more knowledgeable population that can go on to build better and better and better, more ethical and responsible AI for use within education. And that's the end of what I wanted to talk about today, but there's 5 minutes left, which I'm very happy to use some of those minutes before my last slide about what happens next to answer any questions that people may have. If you don't want to ask a question now, you can always ping a question through our help@educateventures.com email address, and we'll do our best to come up with an answer.
So Rose, one of the questions that Mohammed has asked is how would a classroom that operates with machine learning systems to assess student performance actually work? Could they do tests at home on their tablets and computers? Would they each be learning using individualized videos?
That's a great question. I think there's often a misunderstanding when we talk about AI in education that it's going to mean more technology obviously present, being used, more screens, this kind of thing. I don't think that. I think more about it as an intelligence infrastructure, as a data and knowledge infrastructure that can help teachers and machines understand better how to support student learning. And so I absolutely think that's right. I would see a situation where the machine learning is not confined to just being used in the classroom, but also help students at home to learn on whatever technology they have available to them, to have individualized support to help meet their needs. And that would be based on this infrastructure that's the combination of the data that's been analyzed in ways that are informed by what we understand about how human learning happens, and the human teachers, leaders, parents who can add to that data and that analysis to try and make sure that whatever the student experiences is something that really helps to meet their needs. And indeed, the teacher can work with the student to look at the data. That won't be just about how well they're doing at maths, history, geography, or a particular subject, but could also be about their confidence, their motivation, their ability to self-reflect, the extent to which they do or don't understand how much they know or don't know about a particular subject. And so it gives the teacher some information to focus on in conversation to help that student understand themselves better, to understand the data, and whether it's telling them things about themselves that they didn't know before. It might also offer them an opportunity to challenge the AI analysis of that data, to say, well, no, actually, I don't really agree with that, and to push back at the AI system. I think one of the biggest problems that we face in the world of AI and education is the nature of the way in which decision-making happens between AI and human intelligence in the future. We don't want the AI systems making all of the decisions, and we'd like the human decisions to be enhanced by the information the AI can collect. But where is the point where they join together? And I think that's something that we need to understand a great deal more about. One more quick question, Roland? Is there a quick one?
This might not be a quick one, but it's the only one.
Okay.
Tony would like to ask, as we capture more data, isn't there a danger of decreasing the signal to noise ratio for the problem we seek to address?
Such a good question, Tony. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think that comes down to making sure we collect the right data and we ask the right questions of that data. Because what we want is to finesse around, what we want to do is understand a challenge. So with Karian's example of the apparent gap between genders with respect to maths in a junior school, what we really need to do is collect the right data to help us to understand what's going on there, to help us first of all to understand whether the way that we're measuring the performance, the understanding, the competence of the boys and girls is the way we would want to measure it, and then to probe down what might be happening. Karen talked about some of the things that they had tried looking at, but to really try and understand the problem and the relevant data to that problem, so that we really get a better understanding of the problem and the potential solutions to that problem. But it certainly is a challenge, and with the work that we do, it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, is exactly what data, what questions do you ask? And that's where the sort of combination of the human and the AI is particularly important. So I hope that helped. And I've got 5 seconds left to tell you what next. So this is a series of webinars. The next one will be in 2 weeks, and it will be on step 2 of the framework. And I hope that you'll join for all of the webinars. But as we say, there is a condensed version of the slides and the audio that I've done to accompany the slides that only lasts half an hour, that you can download for free from the website. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Karine, and thank you, Roland.
Thanks, Karine.
Thank you.
Take care.